Ever wondered what it means to really exist? Not just you, personally, but like everything.
Whoa, yeah.
We're tackling that head-on today, diving into excerpts from Aristotle's Metaphysics.
Buckle up. Aristotle's one of those thinkers who forces you to look at the world differently.
He really is.
We're talking big questions about reality, knowledge, the whole shebang.
And don't worry, we're here to unpack those famously dense arguments.
Oh, absolutely.
Think of us as your philosophical translators, extracting those aha moments from the text.
Yeah, it's amazing how relevant these ancient ideas still are. Take, for example, Aristotle's point about doctors needing both experience and what he calls art, which is closer to what we call science today.
Right. It's not enough to just have textbook knowledge.
Nope.
Aristotle uses the example of treating a sick person. Knowing the definition of man won't necessarily cure this specific patient.
Exactly. He highlights the limitations of purely abstract knowledge. You need that practical, hands-on experience to truly understand how those universal principles play out in individual cases.
It's that age-old tension between theory and practice. Makes you wonder, what would Aristotle think about modern medicine with all its specialization in technology?
Now, that's a fascinating thought. But before we get too far ahead, let's go back to the basics. Aristotle challenges the pre-Socratic philosophers who believed the universe was made of a single element, like water or fire.
It seems so simplistic now.
And it does.
But those were groundbreaking ideas back then.
Absolutely. And Aristotle acknowledges their contributions. He name-drops thinkers like Empedocles, Parmenides, and Xenophanes, engaging with their ideas directly. But he ultimately argues that you need multiple fundamental principles to explain the complexity we see in the world.
He even uses the example of bone, saying even something as seemingly simple as bone has a certain ratio. It's a glimpse into his later ideas about form and matter.
Precisely. And this leads us to one of the juiciest bits. Aristotle's critique of Plato's theory of forms, those perfect, eternal blueprints hanging out in some abstract realm.
And Aristotle wasn't exactly on board.
He had his doubts. He pokes holes in the logic. Does everything really need a form? Is there a form for dirt? For a bad joke? And how do these abstract forms interact with the messy, constantly changing world we experience?
So if Plato's forms aren't the answer, what is? How does Aristotle ground our understanding of reality?
He digs into the concept of substance. What is that underlying thingness that makes something what it is? It's a question that goes deeper than just the physical stuff.
So it's not enough to say, well, this table is made of wood, so wood must be its substance.
Right. He challenges earlier thinkers who equated substance with just the material components. He uses the example of lines and points. Can those geometric concepts exist independently of physical objects? It's getting pretty meta even for Aristotle.
Metaphysics in action. And speaking of which, this is where Aristotle starts talking about first philosophy, what we now call metaphysics itself. Instead of studying specific things like plants or stars, metaphysics goes for the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's the study of being as being. What does it mean for something to exist at all? What are the fundamental principles that govern existence itself?
Okay, I'm starting to see why Aristotle is considered such a heavyweight. These are some seriously big questions. And he believed it was the philosopher's job to tackle them head on.
Absolutely. To investigate those core concepts like unity, being, contrariety. He wants us to look beyond the surface, beyond just the what of things, and grapple with the why.
And this idea of substance that seems to be a key part of his philosophical framework, he keeps circling back to it.
It's foundational for him. You can't talk about qualities, quantities, or relationships without first understanding the thing they belong to.
Like trying to describe the taste of chocolate without ever referring to chocolate itself.
Yes.
It just wouldn't make sense.
Precisely. Aristotle felt the same way about discussing any concept without a firm grasp of its underlying substance. It's the bedrock upon which everything else is built. But he doesn't stop there. Aristotle's a big fan of logic, and he uses it to dismantle opposing viewpoints.
Like a philosophical warrior, armed with logic and reason. So what's one example of Aristotle using logic to take down a bad argument?
He tackles the idea that contradictory statements can be true simultaneously. He uses logic, thought experiments, and real-world examples to show how this leads to absurdity.
So you can't say it's both raining and not raining right now and expect anyone to take you seriously.
Exactly. Aristotle argues for the law of non-contradiction as a fundamental principle of thought.
Which makes sense. If we can just contradict ourselves willy-nilly, how can we ever have a meaningful conversation, let alone build a coherent system of thought?
Precisely. And this emphasis on logic, on clear and rigorous thinking, is a hallmark of Aristotle's work. But he doesn't just focus on abstract principles. He connects them to the real world, to the experience of change we see all around us.
Right. We've got some notes here about Aristotle's ideas on change, and it seems like a pretty central concept for him.
It's absolutely fundamental to his thinking. And to understand Aristotle's view of change, we need to understand his distinction between potential and actual being.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. What's the difference between potential and actual being?
Think of it like this. An acorn has the potential to become a mighty oak tree,
Right.
but it's not actually a tree yet.
Okay.
Change, for Aristotle, is the process of moving from that potential to actuality.
So it's about fulfilling that potential, that inherent possibility within something.
Exactly. And Aristotle applies this to all sorts of changes. We've got
Yeah.
generation, like the acorn becoming a tree. Alteration, maybe that tree's leaves changing color in the fall. Growth, the tree getting taller and broader. Even locomotion, the swaying of its branches in the wind.
This change is everywhere, constantly happening all around us.
Yeah,
It's not just some abstract concept. It's woven into the very fabric of existence.
you got it. And here's where it gets even more interesting.
Right.
Aristotle argues that actuality, that fully realized state, is inherently better than mere possibility.
So to stick with our tree example, a majestic oak, standing tall and proud, is inherently better than a tiny acorn with the potential to become a tree.
That's the gist of it. A finished house is better than just the blueprints. A symphony performed is grander than the mere idea of the music. Aristotle even takes this concept to a cosmic level.
Okay, now I'm really curious. How does actuality and potentiality play out on a cosmic scale?
Aristotle believes that eternal things, like the celestial bodies, are more actual because they lack the imperfection of unrealized potential.
Oh, interesting.
They exist in a state of perpetual, unchanging actuality.
So those stars we see twinkling in the night sky, they're not just balls of gas, but representations of pure actuality. That's a pretty mind-blowing concept.
Right. And speaking of celestial bodies, Aristotle was fascinated by the movements of the stars and planets. Remember, this is long before telescopes.
Right.
So these observations were made with the naked eye.
And what did those naked eye observations tell him? Did he connect them back to his ideas about metaphysics?
He did. Based on the complex movements of the heavens, Aristotle argued for the existence of multiple unmoved movers.
Unmoved movers. So like cosmic puppet masters,
Yeah.
guiding the celestial dance.
Well, not exactly puppet masters. Aristotle believed these unmoved movers were divine beings, perfect and eternal,
Right.
and they caused the eternal motion of the heavens. They were the ultimate source of change, but they themselves remained unchanged.
Okay, so we're talking about some kind of divine beings here.
Yeah,
Multiple ones, it sounds like.
that's one way to interpret it.
Okay.
And here's another intriguing tidbit. Aristotle suggests there's only one universe.
Wow.
A bold claim, even back then,
Yeah,
and something that sparked debate amongst philosophers.
I can imagine. We're used to contemplating the vastness of the cosmos, the possibility of multiple universes,
Yeah,
but Aristotle kept it singular.
he did. And throughout these excerpts, we see this fascinating blend of early scientific thought and philosophical inquiry. Aristotle is looking to the natural world, making observations,
Right.
and then trying to fit those observations into a larger philosophical framework.
So he's observing the stars, contemplating the nature of change, and then linking it all back to this idea of substance, to those fundamental principles he's so fascinated by.
Exactly, it's all connected. And speaking of substance, Aristotle takes this concept even further and introduces his ideas about matter and form.
We've touched on this a bit, but it's clearly a core part of his thinking. Could you remind us, what's the difference between matter and form in Aristotle's view?
You got it. Think of it like this. Imagine a beautiful vase. The
Yeah.
clay the vase is made of, that's the matter. It's the physical stuff. But the vase's shape, its design, its elegance, that's the form.
Yeah.
It's what makes that lump of clay into a recognizable thing, a vase.
So form gives shape and identity to matter. It's what makes something what it is.
Precisely. And this matter-form distinction becomes crucial for understanding not just individual objects, but also change, cause and effect, and even the nature of being itself.
Okay, so it sounds like we've got these two fundamental principles, matter and form, working together to shape reality as we experience it.
Exactly. And this idea of matter and form is something Aristotle develops more fully in other works, but we can already see its seeds here in the Metaphysics. It's a powerful concept that has influenced Western thought for centuries.
It's remarkable, really, how these ancient ideas still resonate with us today. We may not talk about unmoved movers anymore, but those fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the existence of a higher power, those are still very much alive.
Absolutely. And Aristotle's metaphysics, for all its complexity and challenging language, grapples with those questions head on. It's an invitation to think deeply, to question our assumptions, to look beyond the surface of things.
To dive into that meta level, to borrow a term and explore the underlying principles that govern our existence. And sometimes it takes wrestling with these dense philosophical concepts to gain a new appreciation for the world around us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Engaging with Aristotle isn't always easy, but it's always enriching.
It is, yeah.
Always enriching.
It's like a mental workout, pushing us to expand our understanding, to see the world through a different lens. And speaking of seeing things differently, we're about to wrap up our deep dive into these excerpts from metaphysics. But before we do, we want to leave you with a final thought-provoking question. If Aristotle were to step into our modern world, a world of smartphones and supernovas, what would he see as the fundamental substances, the underlying principles of our existence?
Ooh, that's a good one.
It's a question worth pondering.
It really is. We've journeyed through Aristotle's ideas about experience versus abstract knowledge, his critiques of earlier philosophers, that mind-bending concept of substance, and his exploration of change, actuality, and even the cosmos.
We've covered a lot.
Yeah.
We've seen how he uses logic to dismantle arguments and how he connects those big philosophical ideas to everyday examples.
And through it all, we get a glimpse into the mind of a true philosophical giant, a thinker who wrestled with questions that still resonate today.
So the next time you find yourself staring up at the night sky or contemplating the nature of reality, remember Aristotle. His work is a reminder that the search for truth and understanding is an ongoing journey, one that's full of challenges and rewards in equal measure.
And who knows?
Yeah.
You might just discover your own philosophical aha moment along the way.
That's all for today's deep dive into the fascinating world of Aristotle's metaphysics.
Fascinating stuff.
Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.